All right, welcome everybody. My name is William W. Davis, and I am glad you joined me for the September free webinar. This is going to be interesting for me because I'm going to share with you a spreadsheet that I created to solve a problem that a Scrum team had at the beginning of this year. They needed to create a forecast both for their intermediate releases and also for the entire project. And it's a very large project, a very large project. And they didn't have a good way to do it. And I hadn't been involved with a team that had this kind of problem before. So I had to come up with a different approach in order to help this team do their forecast. So we're going to be talking about how to create a forecast for a very large agile project using a user story map and statistical PERT. So let's get started. So a little bit about me. Many of you have been with me. I see some familiar names, and so you kind of know who I am. I live in South Florida here in the United States, and I've spent my entire career in IT. I do primarily IT project management and Scrum Master work for Scrum teams and just some general Agile coaching among others. Teach at a local state college. If you are familiar with Pluralsight, they're a curator of IT-centric courseware, and I do some courses with them. I do conference speaking. In fact, I've got a couple of conferences. One in 2 days, the Washington, D.C. area has come together. The PMI chapters in the D.C. area, they have a project management symposium on Thursday, and I am doing a live presentation for them on Thursday. And then I have a recorded presentation for the Risk Awareness Week in October. And if you need more information on those conferences, they're available on my website. And I did create Statistical PERT. So about Statistical PERT, it is just an Excel spreadsheet. That's really all it is. It's a pre-built Excel spreadsheet. I created it in 2014, launched it in 2015, presented it at the PMI Global Congress in 2016, and a couple of conferences since then. It is a freely licensed spreadsheet, so it's a copyleft license that allows you to download the spreadsheet, modify the spreadsheet, share the spreadsheet, redistribute the spreadsheet, all under the terms of the new GPL. So I hope that if you haven't tried Statistical PERT before this webinar, you'll be encouraged to download it and experiment with it after this webinar concludes. I like to begin most of my webinars just to remind people what is an estimate. In fact, I was on LinkedIn this morning and I just hopped onto a thread from Stefan Wolpers, who's a popular blogger and Agile thought leader. And there was a thread there on estimates. He posted something that he was sharing on LinkedIn, and I hopped in to just share what I see as an estimate. An estimate is simply somebody's idea about the true value of something unknown. And I can share those estimates in many different ways. A single number, a range of numbers, a probability, using fuzzy language. All of those are simply somebody's idea about the true value of something that is unknown. And so I like to share my estimates and the definition of an estimate in this way. Now, why you might want to use Statistical PERT? It's the same reason why you create estimates. You create estimates to align expectations between yourself and other people. That is why we create estimates, to create alignment about something that is uncertain. And Statistical PERT can help that. And then once we are aligned on the uncertainty that we're facing, now we're in position to make better decisions that optimize our chances of obtaining desirable future outcomes. That's why we estimate, to align expectations and to make better decisions. And that is really why I created the Statistical PERT Excel models. Now, here's today's questions. What is a user story map and why is it used? I'm not going to spend much time on user story maps. I'm just going to introduce what they are. If you are not familiar with user story mapping, it's simply a Google search for you. There's tons of information out there, and I'll point to you kind of the book of user story mapping that I used some years ago. I'll answer the question why it might be important to create a forecast that has a time horizon of years instead of days or weeks. Most Agilists would despise the idea of creating a forecast and say it's ridiculous to create a forecast for something more than 3 months from now. Like, why on earth would you try and and create a forecast for something that could take years. There's no way you're going to know how long something is going to take, particularly if you work in an agile way. The problem is organizations are structured in order to make decisions based upon those kinds of estimates that span multiple months or even multiple years. So as an agile worker, I can't just tell the CFO and the CEO, "Oh, I'm sorry, we're working with Scrum. I can't tell you when this project's going to be done. I'm working in an agile way. We can't tell you." That's just not going to fly. So rather than telling your C-suite you can't create an estimate or a forecast for the future, instead, we take the information that we have today and we share a forecast of what we think the future might look like. And we align on the uncertainty about that. We align on the information that we had available today to create the forecast that we share. I think that's a better way. And then thirdly, the third question is, how can we move from a user story map to a forecasting model, such as the one that I created, which is called Statistical PERT, and particularly the worksheet called the Burn Up Chart worksheet. So let's dig in. I like to begin with a reminder, though. Statistics is not the ability of taking things that are uncertain and creating certainty around them. There is no amount of magic in statistics that's going to take something that is uncertain and all of a sudden, by applying some Excel functions, I create certainty out of something that is uncertain. It's just not going to happen. Statistics do not create certainty out of uncertainty. What statistics can do is help us better understand the nature of uncertainty. It can help us align on the uncertainty that we sense. It can help us create better decisions based upon the uncertainty that we sense. So uncertainty will not be erased from any statistical model, including the ones that I create. Now, if you're not familiar with what a user story map is, the guy who I believe created the concept, his name is Jeff Patton, and he wrote this book, User Story Mapping. You could Google that on Amazon. It's a few years old now. I don't remember exactly when he wrote it. I want to say maybe around 2006 or 2008. I think that's it. I'm not really sure. It's been around for a little while now. And I bought this book some years ago when my organization was transferring into agile ways of working. I read the book and I gleaned from that how to take a project idea and then map it into its component parts. So if you're not familiar with user story mapping, there is a book on that. He has a website, and including some information on the website, a short PDF that explains real high level what a user story map is. It's an artifact that helps create a lot of really good conversation among team members who are building a product together. So the actual value of the user story map is not necessarily the artifact itself. The greater value is all the really good conversations that are occurred in constructing the user story map. Here's an example of what a user story map might look like. I pulled these images right off of Google search. Real simply, a user story map has a backbone, and they're called ribs. So the backbone are the epic ideas or the process flow, and then the ribs are the different tasks that are necessary to be performed in order to create this epic capability or this epic action or this epic step in the process. So in this example, there are 6 activities in this particular representation on a user story map. 6 backbone items with a number of rib items that explain what are the tasks that need to be performed in order to create these different activities. Here's another image pulled right off of the internet. This person shows a narrative flow, which is the backbone. That's the light blue cards, and the yellow cards are the rib items. And then this user story map, there's 12 activities. Okay. Not a little bit bigger than what we just saw, but still manageable on a user story map. Here's another image right off of the internet, and apparently the source is Jeff Patton himself, who shows how to create, looks like some sort of an email process or an email management system. He introduces these pink cards, which I call themes. Then you've got the backbone and the ribs. In this user story map, there are 12 activities, still pretty manageable number. Here's another representation of basically the same idea. This does a little nicer job of showing the different releases that will occur. Each release builds on its prior release. So there's some initial capability that is delivered in release 1, and then we'll build more capability in release 2, release 3, and so on, thus fulfilling these, creating more robust activities or capabilities across the backbone. And this backbone has 12 activities. One more image. This one is somebody before the pandemic, probably, who are co-located together. And instead of using a virtual whiteboard, they actually use a literal whiteboard and sticky notes. That's actually where this idea came from, is people were encouraged to come together, co-locate, and build these product ideas, walk through the different steps in the journey, and use sticky notes to create the backbone items, those activities or steps in the process, and then the tasks that are needed to be performed. And then you have releases that increase the capability of the overall function. And it's a visual representation of all the work that the team will be pursuing over the time that they're working together building this product. So that's a nice visual representation. This one has 21 activities. So in each of these user story maps that we were looking at, it's something akin to looking at a building and saying, okay, how do we build this building? This is a 12-story building. Let's figure out what are going to be the different attributes of each of the 12 stories. And the user story map kind of gives you a big picture of what it is you're going to be building. So this product is a big product with 12 stories high, and we use a user story map to get alignment on this whole process. Now, the problem is, what happens if you have a user story map that looks like this? User story map that has a lot of backbone items, more than 6, more than 10, more than 20. What if you have 50 plus user story, not user stories, 50 plus activities or steps in the process? It's a very, very large process that is mammoth in size. That's kind of like not just building a single building, it's more like building an entire city now, okay? We have a vision not of just building a 12-story building, we have a vision of building a small city. And we came together to come up with this really, really big product idea, and we teased it out over a long period of time to get this bird's eye view of the city we want to build, not just a single building. That's kind of the metaphor of what this team was up against when they started their journey last year. They're not just building a building, they are building an entire city. So the question is, how do you estimate when you're building something so large? It's easier when you're building a single building, but now I'm going to be building an entire city. All right, so that was the problem that we were asked to solve. So here is the problem when you've got a very large user story map that shows a lot of capability, a lot of activities, a lot of process steps that are necessary. And the team has done the best to make that process lean. But even in spite of the fact of leaning out the process, it's still a huge, huge endeavor. It's a huge endeavor. Now, how do you forecast for something like that? Okay, so that is the problem. And the problem is that organizations are structured to make decisions based upon optimizing their return on investment. So if I need to make an ROI decision, I need to know what are the benefits that I'm going to get and at what cost. Now, the business can assess for themselves what the benefits are, and they can characterize those benefits in several different ways. But the CEO and the CFO, they're going to need to know, well, how much is it going to cost? Because in order for me to really understand the ROI of this investment opportunity, we can characterize the benefits we will get if we pursue this opportunity, but we also need to know what the cost is. Now, historically, the way we would answer the CEO's question is we would do BDUF, big design upfront. That's a waterfall process. So in order to tell the CEO how much this effort is going to cost, we would get agreement that this team would come together and do a lot of analysis to do the business requirements and do a lot of analysis perhaps to do preliminary design or even detailed design in order to come up with all the necessary information that we would cost out what it would cost to build a small city. And at that point, we tell the CEO, here's what it's going to cost based upon all this analysis that we did, a big design up front. But of course, if you're working in an agile way of working, you don't do that, right? You don't create a big design up front. So that's the problem. How do you answer the CEO's question? What's the cost of this effort, this capability that I want? But we are working in an agile way and we are not creating a big design up front. That's the problem. All right, so here's the solution. No, not just kidding. It's not a solution. I don't know if it's a solution or not. I'm going to share with you the approach that I am using with a team. So far, we're getting really good results from it, but I'm not going to characterize this as a solution. I'm going to just characterize this as the approach that we are using on this particular project that I am now the Scrum Master on. I wasn't originally the Scrum Master for this project, but I became one over the last, I guess, 6 weeks or so. So now I'm their Scrum Master, newly named Scrum Master on this particular project. Here's the approach that we're going to use. Number one is we already had the user story map, that 30,000 foot view of the small city we want to build. So what we did is we used affinity estimation, in other words, t-shirt sizes, which are relative sizings of all of the backbone items, all of the epics or features. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. Epics, features, backbone items, those are the big activities or value, value, I won't use say value streams, the valuable capabilities. And there's like more than 50 of these things in their user story map. So we use affinity estimation just to say, okay, this is small relative to this, and this is big relative to this. So we used affinity estimation. Again, that's a good Google search if you're not familiar with affinity estimation. Then what I did is I converted their t-shirt sizes into story points. We're familiar with story points in my organization. I just used some heuristics to convert the t-shirt sizes to story points. You don't have to use story points if you're anti-story point person and you rather use just user story card count. You can do the same thing. You got to basically convert a t-shirt size into something numeric in order to create any kind of a forecast. So used heuristics to do that conversion. Step 3 is the organization, the product owner and the others, they had to prioritize the features that they wanted to create. And that's, normal user story mapping is you're going to do releasing in a priority order of capability. So there's nothing new there with user story mapping, prioritize the features. Then this was a new problem that I hadn't faced before. Some of these features in the smaller user story maps, it was pretty easy to kind of build out a capability in a release. But in this one, the features or the backbone items would be developed over multiple releases. In the small efforts that I was associated with using user story maps, we basically built out a backbone item in a single release. But this one is a very large user story map. So these features or these backbone items were going to be delivered over multiple releases. So we had to kind of do some assignment of that. I had to work with a team to understand, and I'm still working with a team to help them understand, let's distinguish between utility and delight. So if we say a backbone item is 100% complete, what we're meaning by that is there's no more work to be done on that backbone item, and that backbone item has achieved delight. We maybe spent 75 or 80% of our effort creating the necessary utility to bring that feature to light. Think of that as your MMP, minimal marketable product, or some people would call that the MVP. So we're going to distinguish between the utility of a feature and the delight of a feature. But if we say a feature is 100% complete, what we mean by that is we're not investing any more in that feature, and that feature has achieved delight status. Step 6, assess what percent is the feature complete at the end of each sprint. This is I don't have a really good way to do number 6. This feels very waterfall like to me. When I used to go with a team and I would go and ask the developers, oh, what percent complete are you done with this component you're writing? And they might report 50% this week. And next week, they might say 60%. The week after is 70%. I don't feel I've got a really good way of assessing feature completeness at the end of each sprint. Right now, I'm relying on the team representing how much complete they feel they are on those features that they're building. And I incorporate that in the forecasting model. So I think number 6 probably has some way of improving. I just haven't spent any time to figure out how to do the assessment better. Number 7, this is more just general advice. Don't worry about sizing things incorrectly. Don't get hung up if a t-shirt size is small, and then when the team is working on the small t-shirt size, they find out it's more complex, and they're like, it's not really a small t-shirt size. This is more like a medium or a large. I don't worry about things like that. I'm like, oh, you know what? We went with what we knew when we initially sized it. I don't change the t-shirt size on work efforts that we are currently working on. I'll simply ask the team, based upon what you are learning, are there any of these features that you need to resize based upon what you are learning? But I don't resize any t-shirts that are currently being developed. And then lastly, number 8 is don't resize features. Oh, actually, that is my number 8. Don't resize features you've already begun working on. That's the same thing as almost number 7. Number 7 is I tell the team, don't worry about it if you size things incorrectly. Sometimes you look at a thing and say, it's small, but it turned out to be bigger than small. Sometimes you'll say, well, I think this is going to be huge. And then when you get to that point, you're like, you know what? When we negotiated with the product owner, it's actually not so big. I kind of rely on what in statistics is the central limit theorem. Sometimes you think something is easy and it's harder than you thought. And sometimes you think this thing's going to be a beast. And then when you get into it, you find better ways of solving the problem. And it's not so bad after all. And so one kind of washes out the other. That's why I tell teams, don't worry about sizing and don't resize the features that you're already working on. Reflect on that learning and see if there's something on there that you should resize based upon your better understanding of the product you're building. So these are the 8 steps that we kind of use going into our forecasting model. Lastly, I'm going to distinguish between utility and delight. I want to go back to that point because this is something I'm going to post on LinkedIn maybe this week. I have a friend who's visiting South Dakota right now, and he was at Mount Rushmore, and this was his observation. The people who built the Mount Rushmore in the 1920s and 30s, they were way ahead of the Agile community because this is the minimal marketable product. This is not feature complete. This is not the original envisioned way that the monument should look. This was the minimal marketable product that became very valuable to the state of South Dakota, drawing 2 million visitors a year to look at these 4 presidents. But if you went inside the visitor center, this is what the actual product was envisioned to look like. Far more detail. George Washington has a whole top coat. You see the hand and arm of Lincoln. There was a lot more detail that was originally envisioned. This might be the delight of the product. It would have been delightful to have this, but instead they went with utility. But utility was actually good enough. This was the guy who designed the monument, and it looks even more different from the way he originally modeled Mount Rushmore. He had Thomas Jefferson to the left of Washington, but working in an agile way in the 1920s and 30s, the stone would not support Thomas Jefferson to the right of George Washington, so they had to redo the monument to put him to the left of George Washington. Okay, so that's the end of the slideshow. Let me go into the models. Let me take a look at the chat window. Are there any questions? Let's see. So let's take a look at the 2 spreadsheets. One is I'm going to drop into the chat window now a link for one of the models that I'm not making it public yet because it's not really intended to be something that I share outside of this webinar. So this is one of the spreadsheets that we're going to look at. If you've been with me at all, you've seen statistical PERT. If you're not, if you are new and you don't know anything about statistical PERT, just go to statisticalpert.com. That's where all my models are found. That's probably, I think you had to go there to register for this webinar. And this is the normal edition. When you first download the normal edition, click enable editing, or else you won't be able to do anything on this spreadsheet. So I click enable editing. It's going to run a little slow, I think, on my machine. Here's a little tip for you. Change the calculation options to automatic except for data tables, or this spreadsheet can run fairly slowly. The other way to speed up the spreadsheet is to delete the one worksheet that is a Monte Carlo simulation model. That's this one. If you don't need it, you can just delete it, and that will also make your spreadsheet run quickly as well. There's no harm in breaking or deleting one of these worksheets. The only couple worksheets you can't delete is you can't delete the VLOOKUPs worksheet, and the footers are linked to the changelog. So you kind of got to leave VLOOKUPs and changelog. The rest of the worksheets are independently built. So you can, if you don't like one of the worksheets, just feel free to delete it. The worksheet that we are going to use is this spurt burnup chart. I have some sample data there for you. If you're not familiar with this worksheet, I actually have webinars that I do. In fact, the webinar that I'm doing on Thursday goes over this particular worksheet. So if you're not familiar with the burnup chart and you want to learn more, there's an opportunity to hop onto the PMI Washington, DC Project Management Symposium on Thursday. And I go over how to use this worksheet. Let me zoom in a little bit. So this is already set up for, looks like 2-week sprints. I'm just going to go ahead and expand this out a little bit longer. You can go up to about 50 iterations. And during the holidays, I set the team capacity at 0%. So I'll just go through here. I'm going to be building a big forecast. So I come through here and say, okay, the last 2 weeks of the year, they're going to be at 0% capacity. All right. That's good. And then I can clear out all of this sample data for the moment. All right, that's fine. Now, the spreadsheet that I built for the forecasting looks like this. That's the link that I dropped into the chat window. When you open it up, it's going to look like this, and I'll introduce this model to you. So we had a large user story map, and we had to figure out, well, how do we create a forecast? How do I use the spurt burnup chart? How do I do that? And this is kind of the intermediate step that we used. So this is somewhat of a brittle model. That's why usually when I create a model, it's very dynamic. This one is not dynamic. There's not much dynamicism with this model. So I have to kind of manually create the themes and the backbone items and associate specific backbone items to specific themes. A theme is just a collection of process steps. In the email example that we briefly looked at, there was one that was like organize email, and another one was manage the email, another one was doing something else with email. So we collect these backbone items under these themes. This is the part that's not particularly dynamic. I have to insert rows in order to represent it. So this is just a representation of the user story map that we did create. And in this example, I have 50 total backbone items. And I show you, well, what happens when you add a backbone item? Well, you just insert a new row. I label it as new, so I know that backbone item 50 was new to the team. So I represent the user story map in this spreadsheet using themes and backbone items. I don't include any of the ribs. So if you're using user story maps, none of the ribs, which are really going to be epics that will decompose into probably a bunch of user stories or something equivalent to a user story in your product backlog. None of the ribs are represented here. This is just a huge user story map, so I'm only representing the backbone items. The major process steps that this product has, I'm representing in this spreadsheet model. I talked about prioritizing. That was very important for this particular team, is to prioritize their backbone items. And the way we did that is we used 5 different priorities. We did not name them priority 1 through 5. There was something more meaningful to the team that I'm working with, but generically, we have 5. That's controlled through the VLOOKUPs. So there is a little bit of dynamicism associated with this spreadsheet model. You can see here that I've got these t-shirt sizes and I've got these priorities. If I want fewer priorities than 5, I just delete the rows that aren't of interest to me. If I want more than 5 priorities, I can insert into this area and it will dynamically show up under the drop down in column C on this EPICS worksheet. Okay, so that's where the priorities come from. These drop downs are right there. So we went through and we prioritized all these backbone items and we did affinity estimation. So all of these backbone items now have a t-shirt size associated with them, somewhere between extra small and extra, extra, extra large. That's just the way this team needed to represent their work efforts. Again, that's controlled by VLOOKUPs. If you only want 3 t-shirt sizes, small, medium, and large, you just delete the ones that you don't like. If you want more t-shirt sizes, like if you want an extra, extra small, you just add it to this VLOOKUPs and it will be available to you in column D. So this kind of represents the user story map that I'm working with on a team. We've got a bunch of themes, a lot of backbone items. We prioritized all the backbone items of interest to the team, and they did all of the t-shirt sizing. So far, so good. All right. I mentioned that we had to use heuristics to convert the t-shirt sizes to something. We use story points. Here's the conversion value that we use. So if it's extra small, it's equivalent to 25 story points and so on. Large is 200 story points. If your team doesn't estimate using story points, maybe you estimate only in completed user stories, card count, you would still use a heuristic to convert the t-shirt size, which is just kind of a relative estimate of something, into a numeric equivalent. And over time, you may change your opinion on what that heuristic ought to look like, but this is how we do it. Basically, 1 doubles the number of the predecessor. All right. So in this example worksheet, I've got a total of 10,000 story points. You might notice that there are a couple of no sizes. And this happened, I included that because this is what happened with our project team. With our project team, our forecasts were going out so far in the future that we had to renegotiate with the project sponsor and said, some of these backbone ideas, like backbone item 8, it's a great idea, but if we included it, it happens to be this extra, extra, extra large capability to the overall product. And our forecast is going to go out even longer than it already is. And we wound up having to de-scope some things. So no size, in the way that we're using it, basically de-scopes some of these backbone items that were part of the team's original user story map. But later, as we try to figure out what can we build in the time box that we have, some of these things became no sizes, and I added a couple of no sizes there. We didn't get rid of them entirely. We left them there because if at some point we can include them, then we'll include them. But at this point, they're not included as part of the project. All right. And then in all of my models, everything that is shaded in yellow, that is an input cell. If it is lightly shaded in yellow, that's an input cell. Virtually everything else is not intended to be an input cell. That said, I didn't use the yellow shading for column B and C, even though those are really input cells. I thought about changing this to yellow, but they're going to be static for the most part. And I decided to not use yellow shading. On my statistical PERT model, though, all the times you see yellow shading, those are input cells to the models that I use. So visually, you can know where you're supposed to be interacting with. If it's not yellow, there's probably a formula behind it, or it is a label. All right. Since we already had the relative t-shirt sizes associated, the column E is just taking the heuristic to convert the t-shirt size into a numeric equivalent. And that's done through column E. There's a total of 10,000 story points for this overall project. All right. And the next part of this, columns G and I and so on, we start to figure out, let's do some release planning. So based upon the priority that we see, we will do we'll do some release planning. Generally, priority one is going to be things that are more of interest to us. So we start to allocate the features based upon the priority. So in release one, I'm going to fully allocate backbone item one to release one. And in order to allocate that, I put the percentage value that will be delivered as part of release one. So since it's extra small, we're going to be fully delivering backbone item one in release one. And then maybe for theme A, we're going to be working on this extra large t-shirt size, backbone item 5, but we're only going to allocate 25% in release 1. And then when we get to release 2, we'll do another 25%. And when we go to release 3, we'll give another 25%, and that'll give us utility, but we're not sure when we're going to get the delight. So rather than allocate the last 25% to release 4, we're going to maybe leave it that way. We're not going to fully allocate all of this at this time. So we've got 25% to release 1, release 2, release 3 is 25%. I forgot to hit enter. And now 75% of backbone item 5, 75% of backbone item 5 is allocated across one or multiple releases. It's not at 100%. You can see the font style changes when it's at 100%. If you over allocate something, you will get a little bit of an error. Whoops. Yeah, you'll get a little bit of an error message if you try and do that. Or if I make this 100%, it's going to say, hey, this is over allocated. You've allocated backbone item 5 across one or more releases, and it's more than 100%. So fix it. And you got to figure out why it's over allocated. So I made it at 25%. So backbone item 5 is allocated 75%. At 75%, we have utility, but we don't have delight. We're going to save delight for later. Now at the total, this total is I've got 125 story points. All right. And we'll do whatever we make sense for the team. Let's suppose that this team generally we think this team is going to deliver maybe 150 story points every sprint. So maybe we'll go through and say, okay, for this extra backbone item, priority 1, extra, we'll also hopefully get 25% of this overall backbone item 6 delivered in the first release. Now I'm up to 325 story points in the first release. Let me see, is there anything else for theme 1 that's priority 1? No, maybe on theme B, we'll work on backbone items 12 and 13. Maybe we'll fully allocate, get it complete, even to the light, we'll get this one delivered. That's up to 425 story points. All right, I'm going to keep moving on because I've only got about 15 minutes, and I'm not going to get through all that I was hoping to get through. So I kind of apologize. I'll try and do my best though. So I've got 425 story points for release 1. I've got 10,000 story points in release 2. Let me go into the spurt model. First of all, I'm going to need to duplicate this worksheet because I have a project forecast and a release forecast that I need to do. So in order to do that, I'll right click on the tab, choose move or copy, create a copy, and then place it anywhere you want. I'm going to place it right next to the existing burn up chart. This is the only way you can copy a worksheet without the charts breaking. If you do it this way, the charts will not break, and then I'll rename this. So maybe this is going to be the burn up for release 1. And this one is going to be the whole project. All right. So at the beginning, today's, let's imagine this was July 12th. For the whole project, the team has got 10,000 story points to do. For release 1, they've got 425 story points to do. And at this point, I can scroll down and actually see the burn up chart. I've got 425 story points to do over course of time, and I don't have any actual history yet. For the project forecast, I've got 10,000 story points to do, but I don't have any history yet. So let's add the history then. after the first sprint, I'll meet with the team and find out, well, what did you complete? And so I'll say to the team, okay, backbone item 1 in our first sprint, did we get that complete? Now, maybe they didn't get to it, or maybe they did. Maybe they got it half done. Whatever it is, I'm collecting what percent complete are you for the entire feature. If the feature is 100% complete, that means I've achieved utility and delight for the feature. We don't expect to be building any more on that feature. Doesn't mean we can't change our opinion in the future. It just means that we got to a point where we're moving on to the other things and we're kind of done with that part, at least as far as we know today. Now, maybe in this example, they're 100% complete because this was sized as extra small. And maybe for this next thing, they got half of all of the work that they were expected to do. So they were expected to deliver in release 1/4 of all the capability that is represented by backbone item 5. If they felt at the end of the first iteration, they're about halfway there to getting that 25% done, then I'm going to say, okay, well, you're like 12%. You're about halfway there. And then over here, how far did you get on backbone item 6? And if they say, well, we feel like we got only about 1/4 of the way there for this thing. Now, this is an extra large feature. You're only 1/4 complete on something that you will only be at 25% feature complete at the end of release 1. So at the end of release 1 will be 25% feature complete. How far did you get to that? Well, we feel like we only got 1/4 there. We're going to need like 3 more sprints just to get to 25% feature complete. So if they said something like that to me, I might say, okay, well, you're about 6% then. Okay, over here, backbone item 3, how much did you get completed there? And they're like, oh, we just kind of barely got started. Okay, so maybe 20% or 10%. I assess how far did you get in making the backbone item feature complete. And then since the easy ones are the ones that are fully allocated to a single release, you have to do a little bit of funky math as I kind of walked you through. When we're only going to get 1/4 of the capability of backbone item 5 and 6 delivered in release 1. And then you might have multiple sprints just to get to that 25%. So your percent column in column G here is representing what percent complete is the overall feature. I'm not expecting it to be more than 25% until release 1 is completed, right? For backbone items 5 and 6. Let's suppose this is all the work that the team got accomplished at the end of the first release. I come down here and say, okay, we're done with 1 sprint. We got 141 story points done in this forecast model. Now, the team may break these backbone items into lots of different user stories. They might have story points they're using to help estimate how much work they can bring into their sprint. I kind of abstracted all of their detailed work in writing user stories and managing user stories inside the sprint. They can do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want to assign user stories or not assign user stories to the actual product backlog items that are part of the Scrum product backlog. I abstract all of that. I don't care about any of that. What I care about is that in this model, we are representing all of the work for release 1 as 425 story points, and collectively, we got 141 story points done, so we're about 33% completed. So let me add the 141 story points to the spurt models. We got 141 story points done in the project. And let's suppose that we don't change anything else in our resizing of anything. So we've got 9,859 left to do. And in release 1, I got 141 story points. So what's left to do? D5 minus E5. We've got 284 story points left to do. Once I add that 1 data point, you'll see there's a purple dot in the burn up chart. I want to make sure that we get through 2 sprints, 2 sprints, so we can see how those forecast lines emerge. So now let's suppose that's the end of release, that's the end of sprint one. Then 2 weeks later, we meet again. Okay, what did you get this sprint? And they report to me, okay, we fully delivered, or we're backbone item 5. It's fully delivered of that 25%. We got to that 25% that's associated with release 1. Great. So you are feature complete at 25%. That was all we were aiming to get done for release 1. How about release 1 for backbone item 6? Backbone item 6 will be 25% feature complete for release 1. How far did you get? You were at 6% when we met 2 weeks ago. And they're like, we're like halfway there. Okay, you're halfway there. You're halfway there to delivering 25%. We've been working together for 2 sprints. So you got 6% of the overall feature delivered in the first sprint and another 6% in the second sprint. How far did you get with backbone item 13? Oh, we're like halfway there. Okay, so it was at 20% the first sprint, we got 50%. All right, and now that's the end of the sprint report. My velocity is 135.5. We've got total 271 story points completed so far. All right, good. So let me update my chart, 271 altogether. So I have 271 minus the 141. That meant I got 130 story points done in sprint 2. All right, what's left to be done? All right, well, what was left to be done was we started with 284. We got 130 story points done. So that's E6. So now there's 154 story points left to do for release 1. Since the team got 130 story points done in the second sprint, I now have enough information with just those 2 data points. I can actually start to see these forecast lines emerge. Okay. Now these forecast lines are really close together because I've only got 2 data points. It's going to take us more than 2 data points to actually have a meaningful cone of uncertainty. So you can see right there, they're going to finish this. It's not going to take them forever to do. So let me get rid of all this. It's only going to take them a couple sprints to get this done. So, all right. So it looks like at this point, both the optimistic, conservative, and most likely lines all intersect the product backlog line for the sprint that ends 8/23. At this point, with these 2 data points, because they delivered a very similar amount of story points in just with those 2 data points, it looks like we will be done not in the next sprint, which ends on 8/9. It looks like we will get all of the release 1 completed by 8/23. It looks like it would be really close. Like if we got a really good sprint coming up, this next one, we might be able to deliver it by 8/9, but all 3 lines intersect just after the 8/9 finish date. So it looks like release 1 will be delivered on 8/23. Ordinarily, these, for me and my team, the releases aren't delivered in just a couple of sprints. It's more like 3 months right now. And the cone of uncertainty is not all real close together like this. It's quite a bit more wide. So the optimistic line might say, we're going to finish release 1 in 3 sprints. The most likely is 5 sprints, and the conservative is 8 sprints from now. That's a more typical experience I have with my project team. Okay, so I'm kind of out of time. If I had more time, what we would do is we would get a little bit more history, and I'll just make up the history though. Like, let's suppose they have a really bad sprint, 80, or even worse than that, 40. Maybe there was a production problem and they didn't get very much done in the third sprint. Well, if that occurs, this is going to be what happens. You see how the cone of uncertainty is much wider now because they are less predictable than they were after 2 sprints. Even still, in spite of having a really bad sprint, it looks like even in the conservative, conservatively, it looks like it's going to finish on 9/6. With that one really bad sprint, it looks like it's going to happen maybe at 8/23 to 9/6. Okay. on the project forecast, if they had a really bad, if on the project forecast, you'll see that the cone of uncertainty will widen a bit. So 96, I'll just make it 96.90. So once the team has a couple of data points, and they're probably going to have some sprints that are higher in what they get accomplished and some that are lower, the forecast lines begin to expand quite a bit from each other. And at this point, the team looks like, oh, wow, it's going to take us, at this point, it looks terrible with just because that one sprint was so bad. Once you get a number of data points under your belt, you'll actually have a much better forecast with 3 sprints, and one of them was erratic, apparently, because it only got delivered 40 story points. The forecast is going to be reacting severely to the lack of data and the erratic delivery over those 3 sprints. If they were more in line with what you would have expected, maybe 90, then the cone of uncertainty will be narrower, but still informative. It looks like this project will not finish right now in 2024. I would have to add more iteration finish dates to find out where the line intersects. All right, we're about out of time. I want to make sure and address any questions that you've got for the last couple of minutes that we're together. Please experiment with a spreadsheet with a model. I'll include a link to the same model in a thank you email that I'll send a few days from now after I finish this recording and clean it up, and then send out the cleaned up recording to the people who couldn't be with us live. But play with the model, the SPURT model for the burnup charts, and then this other model, the user story map release planning model. Unfortunately, I don't have anything that I've documented with this model. So simply ask me any questions about the model. You can see some of the things that we didn't talk about is you can see that after just 2 sprints, this total project is only 3% completed, but the release is 2/3 completed after the 2 sprints that we logged. We're at 64% complete. To add more releases, simply take, basically you're inserting columns and copying these cells to as many releases as you need on the right side of this spreadsheet. Like I said, it's a little bit brittle because it's not written with the same kind of dynamic structure as most of my models. I built this expressly for the project that I'm on, but I thought this might be helpful to other teams that are facing the same challenge of having a large user story map, and they're trying to do whole project forecasting. For the CEO wants to know, how much money am I going to be funding this for and for how long? But you also need to do release planning and come up with forecasts for the current release you're working on, and maybe the release after that if some of the work is spanning multiple releases, and that was the case for me. Okay, I'm checking my chat window. Any questions that anybody has? All right, I don't see any questions. So I'm going to end this webinar, and I look forward to seeing you again in a future webinar. Have a good afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you're from. Bye, everybody.